So today's topic is the impacts of that COVID's had on planning. And the three areas that we wanted to dive into are public input and participation. We host a lot of online meetings. So what is the impact? How has that impacted your communities? Is that a practice that will continue? Relaxed standards and procedures. Many zoning procedures and regulations were eliminated or modified in response to the pandemic. And so we're interested to know, are those going to remain? And then also public space used for private profit. Rights of way and other areas are being used for private profit. For example, retail and restaurants, dining. Should that have happened, and should that continue to happen? So today we're very fortunate to have three experts in the planning field. Kim Maroney from Oak Park, who's the director of economic development. We also have Dick Carlisle, who's president of Carlisle Wortman Associates, planning consultant with numerous communities throughout Southeast Michigan. And also Jeffrey Flukowski, superintendent of planning and zoning for Waterford Township. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Jim Schaefer, who will be moderating our session. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. And thank you to our panelists and everybody who's in attendance today. So without further ado, let's kick it off to talk a little bit about public input and participation. Basically, we zoomed right into everything on the heels of COVID. So what's been the impact of that? We want to start it off with Kim. We'll have about 5 minutes for each speaker and then 5 minutes for Q&A from the chat box. So please do put your questions or comments in the chat box. Go ahead, Kim.
Thanks, Jim, and thank you everybody for attending today. In regards to getting everything online, like most of you, I'm sure everybody scrambled at the first onset of this. We were able to adapt pretty quickly. We have a great IT department, so we started with Zoom meetings. I think that the one thing that I've heard other communities say is that they didn't have any public meetings in regards to input for special land uses or anything like that, that they held off on doing those. We continue to do all of those. The public notifications were sent out with the Zoom links, meeting IDs, and we actually had better participation both from the public as well as all of our planning commissioners and our zoning board of appeals members. We had almost 100% attendance through the entire pandemic when we were online, as well as the increased residents' participation. Prior to COVID, we very rarely had anybody from the public attend a meeting. So it was nice to actually see more public participation. We heard many comments from the participants that it was a lot easier to do it online from the comfort of their home, not having to leave the house. So that was a nice change. Back in July, we went back to in-person public meetings, and immediately we had the drop off again of public participation, and even from our commissioners being able to attend the meetings. We recently switched back to online meetings till the end of the year since they are allowed. We've discussed the hybrid option. The hurdle we have all the technology in place. It's more of a staffing issue to be able to have somebody on site to handle doing the hybrid portion of it. So we're still determining whether or not we'll be doing that moving forward. We didn't have any issues. I know some communities were hacked into their meetings. We were fortunate enough to not have that type of an issue in our community. We also tried to make it easy for the public to participate in reviewing any of the documents prior to the meeting as well. So we made it very available to them, even though our offices were closed. They could either email me, call me, or schedule an appointment to meet in person to view any of the documents for the upcoming meetings, as well as them being posted online. So I think the biggest hurdle was meeting with the actual clients for projects moving forward. Sometimes it's hard to go over a site plan online. It's a little bit easier to do those things in person and make adjustments. So we had a little bit of a hiccup there, where we'd have to maybe even schedule meetings in person. Our city manager allowed us to do those in person, as long as we socially distance. So that was probably our major hurdle through the whole pandemic. And that's all I have on that topic.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kim. Dick, why don't you pick it up and go from there?
Okay, well, thank you. I actually have a couple of opening observations, Jim. First of all, it's really nice to be able to attend the meeting with Kevin Christensen without him physically being here and planting a kiss on my cheek like he usually does. And second of all, Brett, I'm not sure you're aware, but you can attend continuing education from a bar if you like, that's the beauty of Zoom. So just a couple of opening observations, but from our perspective, we do represent quite a few communities that have varied expertise and varied needs and different demographic characteristics, and rural and urban and suburban. And so consequently, you could probably guess about what the some of the challenges were for many of them in terms of going to online types of meetings, no matter what the format might be. And from our standpoint, I mean, it really pivoted on two things: the quality and the capability of the receiving it, the sending end, which is of course our local governmental units, and also how well equipped and comfortable people are on the receiving end. And I think in both cases, this has really necessitated a lot of soul searching and improvement of technology and education on everyone's part from that standpoint. Something that it's interesting, and there was an article this morning in the Times that I was pointing out to my colleagues here that said that the title of it is Past Pandemics Remind Us COVID Will Be an Era, Not a Crisis That Fades. And so consequently, I think we should be looking at this as planners that, yeah, there are going to be certain aspects of this that are going to probably get better. Let's hope, certainly hope we see it happening to some degree, but there are going to be some long-lasting effects. And I think the idea of using technology to a greater extent to communicate with one another in our field is going to continue in many respects. I think a lot of continuing education, for example, has been very effective doing it virtually, and probably will continue, partly because of time and expense that people have to spend doing that kind of thing. But back to local government, for many people, it's become both a frustrating and an intimidating experience for not just the people that are participating, but for planning commissioners, public officials, and et cetera, because having to deal with a bit of technology to do your business, especially if that technology is not the best at this point in time, in many cases, it can be very intimidating. But on the other hand, it can also be quite empowering for some, for many people to participate in ways that they maybe never were able to before. People that may have physical challenges, or people, frankly, if you're away, or if you're at a remote location and you're still able to participate in local government. However, we discovered that with many of our communities, they were just not, they were not capable, frankly, in many cases of, and not equipped to be able to run meetings, in a virtual, any kind of virtual manner. So being the good consultants that we are, we figured out a way to be able to help them. From our standpoint, so far to date, we have run over 300 meetings for our clients, and in probably more than a dozen communities, because they needed help in being able to, for someone to be able to organize and host the meetings. But a few lessons that we learned out of all of this is, first of all, you have to have a tutorial that is tailored to each client's needs. I mean, there's not necessarily a one size fits all. So having a good tutorial in place needs to happen. The tutorial is not enough though, because you're going to, we found that many people actually needed some hands-on training, sometimes even on an individual basis, to actually be able to use the technology that was there available to them. Communities that had community access channels definitely had less of a problem because they had greater capability, and they had the community access channel personnel be able to help them with a lot of this stuff. And of course, we all know that the quality and availability of broadband is a big issue. So many communities that we work with right now have found it sufficiently effective that there are aspects of it that they don't want to give up. And even after we may have the virtual meetings permission lifted, many want to continue with some kind of hybrid approach, which for those of you that are maybe doing that, that does require some higher level of technology, and for which you need probably some specialized help and consultants or IT help to be able to do that. But from our perspective, we would like to see that option continue, because we think that in the long run, it really encourages more participation. It increases the accessibility to local government that heretofore, in many places, it's not really been available. There are a lot of things that you can do. I mean, we have conducted, full master plans virtually. We did the City of Berkeley master plan completely virtually, including citizen public workshops and the like. And the feedback we got was extremely positive in terms of how effective the process was. We've done a design workshop for a city of Northville, where, with breakout rooms and showing design concepts, which was really tricky, but it worked. But again, it all requires a lot of advanced planning to do project-related virtual meetings. And I will warn you, from those in the public sector here, it's not a cheap process. It's an expensive process. While it, for it to be effective, you need to spend the time and the money and have the expertise to do it right, frankly. Otherwise, people will be highly disappointed. So, Jim, those are my observations about this subject, and we can move on.
Excellent. Thank you, Dick. Jeff, take it away.
Hi, everyone. This is Jeff Flukowski, Superintendent of Planning and Zoning for Waterford Township. Oddly enough, I started with the township 2 weeks before the government shutdown, which was I still don't have an ID badge. I don't have a copy code for the printer yet. So I didn't meet my planning commissioners for a whole year, which was very interesting. We did see a lot of things that Kimberly mentioned. Our planning commission attendance was up very high, which was really nice because they were able to attend at all places and locations, which was really good. Waterford has as you probably are aware of, a very lake town kind of feel. And as a result, we have a high snowbird population. So it was interesting to get the perspective from people that, were attending public meetings in Waterford from their condo in Florida during the winter. So we did find that to be very interesting. We did have, some catch-22s with that, however. A lot of, since we are inherently an older population, a lot of people struggled with learning how to log in, how to participate. I think training, as Dick mentioned, is a very big important thing when it comes to that. However, as someone mentioned, there's a lot of platforms. For example, in Waterford, we don't use Zoom. We have a contract with GoToMeeting, which had a different type of layout and required a different type of training. Someone who went to one meeting for Zoom got very confused when they got to GoToMeeting. And that caused a lot of problems here for us. Additionally, some seniors just threw in the towel and they just didn't want to participate in it. But they still wanted to be parts of the meeting. So we found, which is oddly enough, someone would host a GoToMeeting in their home, and we would have 20 seniors packed into, the meeting looking like this, getting right next to each other to attend. And is that much safer than an in-person meeting? I don't think so. So we did have some issues like that we tried to mitigate, and I think education was the big thing there. When we first went to the shutdown, we first went to trying to operate remotely, we actually had some good weather, and we had a lot of our public meetings outdoors, which that worked really well. But the problem with that we were starting to get to was that our meetings were based on the weather, And when they're inconsistent, we were starting to worry about the legalities of having a meeting where everything was in public, and then the next meeting, everyone had to go remote. And then if someone had, a development that had a huge amount of public participation, and the next month it didn't, there was some inconsistencies, and we were worried about, justification for a lawsuit if we, God forbid, got a denial because of a high amount of public process. So that was something that we were worried about. So we went just to remotely from there. And I mean, pretty much resonating the same way with Kim. It did work out in some aspects and it didn't work out in others. We did get a lot more response from the younger members of Waterford who generally aren't as vocal, which, I mean, that's pretty common. People don't show up to meetings as much if they, have a lot more on their plate. They've got their families, they've got, they're just starting their new career. So they were able to attend more. And frankly, I mean, let's be honest, guys, we see people going to public meetings more because they're against something more than they're for something. And so when something was more easily for them to just click a link and attend it, we did get people who showed up in favor of more projects than you'd expect, before going remotely. And I was very happy to see that. People were more inclined to, but again, also, we had some unruly behavior issues as well. When you have an increase in anonymity, people feel more okay to say whatever they want in inopportune times. And unlike Zoom, where the controller has the ability to mute and unmute anyone at any time, on GoToMeeting, people are able to just unmute themselves at any given time. So I had staff planners just constantly muting people who were constantly trying to speak up in a meeting, and it allowed for a lot of unruly behavior, especially towards the beginning or with any very controversial items. And it made it hard for the public participation process to go, as per the laws require it. So that was a big issue that we tried to overcome. And eventually, I think it worked out pretty well for us. Now we are in person currently, and it seems to be going very well. People are respecting any type of PPE requirements, any type of guidelines that we have, and I think we're currently doing I think as good as we can given the situation that we're in.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Jeff.
One other thing I want to
go
bring up, one of the bullets you said, things that are in place that are never coming back. Well, I've been kind of using, we have, inherently some antiquated models here in the township, and I've been using COVID to bring, Waterford kicking and screaming into 2006. And some of those things are, we require, before COVID, we require, if you want to do, just a regular site plan approval, 11 full-size copies of all of your drawings, no digital submissions whatsoever. And I thought that was absolutely insane. And a lot of our staff members, we've been doing it this way for 30 years and we're not changing. And we got to use COVID as an excuse. Well, you're going to have to because no one's submitting things in paper anymore. And now that we have the technology set up and people are learning to edit and modify PDFs and send their comments digitally, that's never coming back. We're going to be using a digital submission process post-COVID onward. That's all I have.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Jeff. Mike, what do we got in the chat room? And please do put your questions or comments in the chat room so we can share with the group.
Yes, we don't have any questions as of now, but yeah, as Jim stated, please enter any questions you may have right now if you'd like.
Go Southfield.
Okay, we're gonna move on, Mike, or we got, looks like we got one.
As more of a comment.
Okay. All right, again, there's okay to, if something comes to your mind on this topic, go ahead and throw it in the chat. We will have plenty of time for questions and answers as we go. So let's go ahead and move on to the second, relaxed standards and procedures. A lot of zoning procedures and regulations basically got eliminated or were greatly modified pretty quickly in response to the COVID situation. What should stay, what should go? What are your thoughts on that? We'll go ahead and kick it off with Dick this time.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Let me preface my comments by saying, these are the times that give planners the opportunity to show their value. And I strongly encourage you to be thinking about this, not just the short term, but definitely the long-term implications that we're going to see. Particularly, we've certainly seen the short term, and I'll speak briefly about that. But from the long-term standpoint, I think you need to really begin to evaluate and review, economic data regarding the long-term implications for land use. Will we have the necessity for office space? What types of commercial uses are going to become more or less popular? I mean, we know that the amount of dollars being spent on food, for example, and groceries, has skyrocketed. Obviously, home improvements, building supplies, all of those types of things. All the data that you read about that shows that every one of those industries are skyrocketing. Things, recreational equipment, things of that nature are going to be are already in high demand. You look at a lot of places that sell any type of outdoor equipment like RVs or ATVs, and you see that their lots are empty because they've been sold out. So, whether that will continue, that remains to be seen. But I think from a standpoint, your value can very much be demonstrated for the communities that you work in by analyzing and beginning to advise your communities in terms of what you view based on the data and the research, what the long-term implications are going to be for land use patterns in your community. Probably going to see, changes in housing patterns. People are going to be wanting to live closer to the goods and services that they need, and which is things we've been saying for years. But I think COVID really demonstrated the value of being able to live close to a grocery store, for example, or close to a drugstore where you can get your COVID testing or your shots or whatever else. So I encourage you to really use your talent in that regard to forecast the changes that you see in your communities. Obviously, one of the most obvious things that we saw in many areas was the demand for, the changes in the food service area. Obviously, Kim will talk a little bit about, the outdoor seating that has occurred in her community. In my experience in that regard, most communities have standards for outdoor seating that definitely require a process. Sometimes it's administratively. Usually it's before a planning commission. Sometimes it even requires a special land use because frequently a public space is being used for that outdoor seating, especially in places, in downtown places. Well, what I found was communities were asking us, how can we get around those standards? Because we have, this restaurant or that restaurant or this place of business that we're afraid they're going to go out of business if we can't expedite, the ability to have outdoor seating. So what I did see from the relaxed standards and procedures were probably emergency procedures being put in place, whereas land ordinance standards were probably not being met. Short term, was that an okay thing? Probably. But long term, I would recommend to you that things like that are a slippery slope, and that sooner than later you should probably get a handle on that and codify the changes that perhaps were implemented by policy while still implementing the kind of controls that need to be put in place for public safety, noise, public safety, public health, the things of that nature that outdoor seating and certain types of outdoor dining and things of that nature bring with them. Same thing with things such as drive-throughs and pickup windows. We saw a lot of informal changes in that particular regard, and now they're becoming more formal. And I think as you move forward, I think that there's still going to be a trend that food service is going to be done as much perhaps through pickup and delivery as it is going to be through actually dining in. So I think we need to plan and think about that in the future. We all have enjoyed the popularity of food trucks in some of our communities and actually have planned for it and actually have tried to put aside areas for it. But I don't think we probably could not have envisioned during COVID where they were popping up in a lot of different places. And again, not necessarily a bad thing, but probably something in the future that you will need to bring under control because, obviously, while it might provide a valuable service, properly, perhaps unregulated, can create certain issues when related to traffic and parking in certain locations where they might be popping up. One of the things that we've noticed most definitely, and this is something that Brett and his group had recommended for years through the One Stop Ready program, is electronic submission of plans. And in my mind, that's been a good thing. In some respects, it has been a not so good thing, for not the reason that it's not a better way to do it. It's just that communities have not put standards in place in terms of what their expectations are for an electronic submission. And I did see a comment from someone from Southfield that say that they did put procedures in place, and that's really wise because I've received some very well organized electronic submissions of site plans, and then we receive ones that are 136 pages, where we have to print out every single page, on our plotter. So consequently, we need to have we need to have standards in place in terms of what you expect in terms of an electronic submission. And I think, as Jeff probably mentioned, or Kim, I can't remember which, you're going to have some planning commissioners that are just not going to accept anything but paper submissions. And that's, that does put an extra burden on staff to have to deal with that. But do I think electronic submissions are a smart thing to do? Absolutely. Do I, being able to have pre-application meetings, which, Run One Stop Ready also is advises, doing those through Zoom meetings has been absolutely fabulous. It saves time, it saves money, it saves energy consumption by not having to drive to a meeting. And I found it to be very effective. So if anything, you should be increasing the use of technology to do things like that. So those are my observations in that regard, Jim.
Okay, thank you very much. And we'll go ahead then and kick it to Jeff.
Hi again, everyone. We did put forward a lot of relaxed standards and procedures. I'd say the big one is before COVID, we didn't really have any temporary use approvals. And that was a really interesting thing that the food trucks thing was huge. Food trucks generally were, before COVID, it was something that had to go to the Board of Trustees to approve and review. It was a very scrutinizing, very unfriendly process. And now it's an outdoor temporary use. It's a very simple, we can approve it within an hour or so. And it has done really well, and the world hasn't burned to the ground yet. So these are procedures that we're hoping to continue moving forward. Unfortunately, as a township, we don't own our roads, so we weren't able to make a lot of public spaces in those areas. We have no downtown, but I wouldn't be doing my job without saying there is an RFP going out today for a master plan for Waterford Township, just letting everyone know. So as a result, we've kind of relied on the individual parcel, and to do that, we had to do a lot of relaxed standards. And, the garden variety ones that a lot of townships were doing, if, only 25% of the occupancy for the restaurant is required, why do they need 100% of their parking? We, temporarily suspended all parking requirements, and we allowed there's your patio space. Then we allowed that as, a temporary, currently in Waterford, to have outdoor seating of any kind. It's a special use approval. So, it's a 2-month process, a public notification process, just to, throw up 2 tables and 2 chairs. And now we were able to put that forward as an emergency thing. And again, the world hasn't burned down now that people can eat outside. So we're continuing this party. We're seeing how this goes. And I'm not interested in closing down anything that doesn't, cause anyone any problems. And we've been using that to justify making it easier in our future ordinance amendments to allow for outdoor dining. And that's been great. I mean, Waterford Township is a heavily auto-centric environment. It's actually easier to build a drive-through facility than it is to have any outdoor seating. You could currently in this township, you can have a drive-through right next to a residential community without a special use approval. There's no public notification process. There's no public participation process. It's a one and done. And that's something that as a planner in this town, I'm concerned with because as Dick mentioned, these drive-throughs are going to continue, and they're going to be more and more of them we're seeing getting built. And as a result, should they be so easy to build? I asked that question in environments where you're hoping to build more of a placemaking type of approach, especially in a town that already has such a substantial amount of auto-centric businesses like Waterford with its two very large auto commercial corridors. So that's something that, you know, we're posing the question now. And COVID's definitely, you know, starting that conversation even more, which is really nice to see. Some good news, we're a heavily recreational community with all of our lakes. The boat industry is popping right now, which is very fun to see. Our lakes have been more used than I could ever say before. Our public beaches were very, very heavily used. We have a lot of private areas too that, you know, those industries kept going. And that's really good to see. Nothing ever shut down there. Boat ownership is very much on the rise. Our trail systems have been very popular. Our beaches have been very popular. We generally did do a lot of relaxed standards in terms of just the acceptance process, the digital thing we mentioned. We didn't waive fees, but we significantly reduced them. What would have been a $2,500 approval to get an outdoor patio was $100. So that's pretty much what we did there. I think that's everything I have for this topic. Pretty much the way we're handling it now is we made all these relaxed standards due to COVID, and we really have no intention of unrelaxing them until a problem arises.
Very good. Thank you, Jeff. Kim, take it away.
Thank you. Like Jeff mentioned with the outdoor dining, we were a little bit different in the aspect that we did have a good ordinance in place that allowed us to administratively approve those already, as well as using public spaces. So we were fortunate enough to not have to amend any of those. It was more promoting them to the restaurants to have them adopt them. We had only one restaurant in Oak Park prior to COVID that actually did outdoor dining. So we actively promoted it to the restaurants to encourage them to utilize it to get more business. We also waived any fees in relation to that. It used to be an annual fee. We waived that, and then we also changed our ordinance to reflect that it's just a one-time application fee, and after that, there is no charge for outdoor dining space. We also allowed sidewalk sales into the public spaces and parking lots. And even in the outdoor dining, we really relaxed the parking standards because there weren't as many people allowed in to any of the retail or restaurant facilities. So if they wanted to utilize parking spaces to encourage more people to come, we certainly allowed that. All they really needed to do was to notify our department so we didn't have code enforcement out there. If they had any tents, they needed to pull permits and have them inspected by the fire marshal. We also waived any temporary sign permit fees and allowed extra signage for all our businesses to utilize, whether it was, promoting curbside pickup, if it was, putting their order phone number out there, whatever they needed it for, we encouraged them to utilize that. We removed that free extra temporary sign recently, and then just reinstated it because we realized a lot of, I apologize, my dog. Many are needing hiring signs up. So we reinstated that policy to allow for additional signage as well for that. As many of you know, that's probably the biggest struggle for businesses right now is hiring. So we want to give them every tool available to get new hires. The other thing we realized too is with the restaurants, there was a need for walk-up windows to pick up carry-out orders as opposed to coming into the businesses. During COVID, we were actually in the process of amending all of our zoning ordinances. So we were allowed to add a few things in there that would make it easier moving forward with COVID, and created standards for if you wanted to have a restaurant with just a walk-up window. We also had a few restaurants and breweries in the process of being built, and we encouraged them to add those, and they quickly did add those, especially for the breweries. They had walk-up windows that go directly to a food truck to service their clients. The other thing we noticed too was a lot of our outdoor spaces were being utilized, and we have, I'd say in our community, neglected our outdoor spaces and recreation facilities for many years. And it's been something that we've been looking at, but never really tackled. So I think that's an important part that came out of COVID too, is we escalated doing a new recreation master plan and a recreation asset study to see what we can do and make changes moving forward, and better utilize any of our recreation facilities. I think that's pretty much, oh, the only other thing I noticed too, that we made changes or we're making changes with is the transportation aspect. With bus services not being as frequent as possible, again, because of staffing shortages, we found the need for more available ways for our residents to get from their jobs or to stores or what have you. We have a lot of residents in our community that don't have vehicles and rely on public transportation. During COVID, actually, that spring, we released the MOGO bikes into our community, which took off a lot more than we even anticipated. So we are currently looking at adopting some e-scooter standards so that we can start getting things like Lime and Bird into our community to handle that last mile issue for a lot of our residences. And that's all I have. Thanks.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Kim. Mike, what do we got? Anything in the chat?
2 for 2 for nothing in the chat.
Oh, here we go. We got something.
Okay. All right. Wow. It's a long one. Thank you, John Martin. I didn't think parking was even considered when quickly approving outdoor seating. What about other businesses using public space for profit? In addition to food trucks, things like yoga, Zumba, boot camp, etc., having classes outside during COVID. Should they be allowed to continue changing for service using public space?
Charging for service. Yeah.
I believe we'll touch upon that a little bit in the next topic, but does anyone want to answer or have a comment? Please comment.
Well, do we want to hold that and hold that for the next session? Because that's essentially what we're moving into. Does that sound like a plan?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So with no further ado then, Jeff, can you kick us off on a conversation about borrowed public space for private profit? The idea as elicited in that John Martin's comment regarding public taxpayer funded right-of-way or land being used for private profit, things like retail, dining, food trucks, etc. What are the thoughts about that in terms of should it have happened and should it continue? Jeff, take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think any land use that only serves one purpose is a dying concept. Mixed use is, maybe not everything should have a condo on it, but I feel like everything, mixed uses should exist for any type of land mass you have. And I don't think public space is immune from that. Townships have consistently used its assets to leverage economic benefits, both for the township and the community, to offset taxes. And I don't see why, this is if anything, this is just giving us more ways to do so. Waterford has not, unlike a lot of the communities, we don't own our roads, so we weren't able to do that. But what is interesting is we are a huge lake town, and that is also in itself public land. This has been a very controversial thing with us, because a lot of our members have been very happy that, they can continue to enjoy Waterford's amenities during COVID because they're outside using these lakes. But a lot of people have also been upset because they find that their lakes are more popular now. And I get often phone calls from people saying, this is a private lake and there shouldn't be so many people on here. And I say, well, your lake is owned by the DNR and it's not a private lake. You might have private access to it, but other people can access it in other means, be through a friend of theirs that lives on our lake or a public beach on that lake. And people have a hard time adjusting to that. We made an ordinance amendment during COVID that allowed what's called an outfitter's use, which was, let's say you're someone who has a yoga studio in our town, you're able to take a paddleboard class out onto one of our lakes and conduct yoga on there. Or let's say you have you want to do a fishing guided tour, or you want to do, let's say, a trail through the Clinton River. We offered, you don't have to necessarily own property on, the waterfront to be able to access these DNR public lands for this. And I mean, all of environmental industries that have recreation are going to use public land to some extent, unless you have, private hunting grounds or, your own private river, which I can't imagine that. So this has kind of historically been a thing, just more popular now because of COVID. And we're just trying to find more ordinances to make that easier and kind of, roll with those punches. So I would say that, yes, we intend to continue to leverage these. Some things that we do have issues with are discussions of insurance. We didn't use our parkland for any type of business because we were very hesitant to allow for people to conduct classes, and how would they be insured? Let's say someone was to do taekwondo or something on parkland and someone gets hurt. We weren't able to answer that question, and we had a hard time finding any private sector people coming to us that would be able to answer that question at all either. But I would love to see what other townships, how they handle that question when it comes to actually using parkland as opposed to lakes. So that's something that we never really jumped onto, and I would love to see how that would work out. We did find a lot more interest in trails. We again, our recreation community, trails are part of our lifeblood, and I was able to really use trails are more than just people coming off of the street wanting to visit our town. Now it's something so much more than just people here having fun. It's the only thing you could do, and if this isn't the first time this is going to happen, there's going to be other situations where stores are going to be closed, where power outages happen, where people are going to want to use trail systems beyond just like it's almost like this is emergency infrastructure at some point, trails. And that's kind of the argument we've been making of how important these types of recreation amenities are beyond just people wanting to enjoy the weather. It's people looking for other things to do that they can no longer when they can't do something else. And that's really been, it's prioritized our recreation assets so much more than they used to be. And that's been really great to see.
Okay, great, Jeff. Thank you. Kim?
Thank you. I'd have to piggyback on what Jeff said. I think the outdoor assets are the biggest thing that we've seen a new focus on, and that's why we're doing our new master plan for the recreation. We did have some businesses that just randomly would pop up in the parks, doing a yoga class and things like that. For the most part, we didn't have an issue with it, but then we started to get some dog obedience classes showing up that we were worried more about the safety of the other people within our parks. They would let the dogs off the leashes and things like that. So we are currently looking at how we can regulate that better. We want to make it accessible, but then again, we still want to make it safe and not a liability for the city. So if anybody has any thoughts or ideas there, of course, we are open to hearing those. In regards to using, some of the other public spaces for profit, I guess I would say, one of the things we did is we created a social district in one of our new mixed use districts. And I don't think that it's something that we want to see a profit on. If we want to make sure that the city is providing the tools and resources by allowing our public parking facilities to become part of the social district, to help our businesses not only survive, but thrive. So we would rather see them succeed in offering the public space for no fees, then we would want to see them leave the community because they weren't able to make it. So we think that that's a fair trade-off by not charging them for the use of the public space. Now, when it comes to the recreation side of it, we'll see how that plays out. But in using, for instance, our parking areas and what have you for the businesses to utilize during these unprecedented times, we think it's just something that we should do to support our businesses. That's all I have.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kim. Dick?
Well, again, I look at this as we look forward into the future. These are not only this subject, but in a much broader perspective. That it is planners who should be, trying to define the things that we should be thinking about in the future in regards to this particular pandemic issue and any other types of unexpected consequences. You know, we're really pretty good at planners of planning for things that we know, you know, where there's a set of facts and set of parameters with which we are familiar. We may not be as good at planning for the unknown. And yet we are trained, you know, to be able to evaluate and, you know, how to establish a process and evaluate how we be able to develop a set of expected responses to unexpected.
Looks like
Did
we
we lose
lost.
him?
Yeah, I think we lost Dick. He had indicated earlier that there was
Probably. No other time can I think has challenged us more. Jim, I'm getting a note. Are you able to hear me? Okay.
Yeah, you went
Okay.
out for about 30 seconds. You're back.
Yeah, that's part of the unstable connection here that we have. Anyway, my point being is that think broader, you know, think in much broader terms as planners in terms of all of these types of issues and, you know, be leaders in this particular regard, because frankly, if you don't do it, I don't know who's going to do it. I think that the whole idea of public space offers some really exciting opportunities because, you know, I think if this has forced us to sort of bring placemaking, you know, into a real laboratory, and that is, you know, our environment in which we are, you know, planning. And I think there's been a lot of great experimentation, you know, trial and error, and the use of, you know, public space for private purposes, or, you know, you can argue that maybe even those private purposes contribute to public purposes. But I would suggest to you that moving forward, you know, do this within a context of a plan in which many people are involved. For example, you know, I think we're going to start hearing a little bit, and I think we already are in certain downtowns, you know, a little bit of pushback from, you know, other businesses that don't necessarily benefit from the use of the public space that, for example, restaurants have, and whether it's affecting their business or not. So I think a much broader picture needs to be evaluated when it comes to things like that. And really, you know, we need to be a lot more inclusive in terms of who we involve in that conversation. But I have to say that just from a sort of historical perspective, which I think is probably why, you know, Schaefer asked me to participate in this. But, you know, I remember the time when, you know, people thought it was a good idea to do permanent closures of downtown streets and create a mall. I don't think we see too many of those anymore, do we? And so the temporary use of this space in a very creative way has really created some sort of exciting and new, you know, activities in many areas, probably in places where they hadn't thought about it before. But doing it on a more ad hoc or temporary basis is really you know, offers some exciting opportunities for a whole variety of activities, not just food type activities. You know, in response somewhat to Mr. Martin's comment about the whole issue of parking, you know, when it comes to use of public space, I don't necessarily advocate that this be done in a manner of a zoning ordinance, for example. I think you should be regulating this through licensing and permitting. That's more of a general type ordinance, because I really think the use of the public space is more of a decision of the decision-making body, the councils, the boards, things of that nature. And I think you can control, you know, and control that activity much better through a licensing and permitting process than rather through zoning from that standpoint. And so I do recommend that you think about that in those terms, but think about it in a much broader conversation and perspective in terms of all who the use of that public space may affect. So,
Okay, and would anybody want to kick in and speak to Mr. Martin's question, following up on Dick's comments? Maybe I could just elaborate on that. Kim, Jeff, do your communities charge a licensing fee when they seek to use a park or handle the, Jeff, you indicated there was insurance issues, but Kim, how do you handle insurance if somebody wanted to use a public park, that kind of thing?
Well, again, we're still trying to work through that process, but we'll probably likely have them add the city as a named insured on their policy for that space. We're thinking we're going to do this through a special event type license with the city. We just haven't figured out all of the firm details on how we want to handle it. So wasn't something we anticipated, and we're still working on that.
Yeah, similarly, sorry. Similarly, we haven't been charging to use any of our public spaces. We've kind of just been turning a blind eye and hoping no one does start a dog boot camp at our parks. And when I say leveraging our assets, I don't necessarily mean, you know, the money, the way I see it, the money that we get from any type of temporary license to just, you know, teach, to take a fishing tour on one of our lakes is not what the asset that's not the ROI that I'm seeing. I'm seeing that after that, they're using our marina, they're stopping at our restaurant, they're going to our bar for the night, they're using a hotel. Those are that's the ROI we're seeing as a community, and we're not going to throw up a barrier to make $100 on, you know, a license for one business to do this 100 times when we could get 100 people using a bar. That's how we see it. So we're going to continue to be doing it this way. We're not seeing any problems so far. If we do, we'll get to that when we get to that. Currently, though, anything that would pose a significant danger, such as say, a dog camp, that wouldn't be allowed. And that would be something that's just our zoning ordinance says clearly where those can and cannot be conducted.
You know, Jim, I wouldn't be surprised to find most communities, in fact, I'm not surprised to find most communities already have some procedures in place for permitting for use of public facilities, use of parks, rules and regulations associated with it. And when I'm kind of with Jeff on this whole thing. I mean, I don't think it's not necessarily a fee-based permitting system, but rather, a system to ensure that there is, probably the most popular examples in the past where, use of public space for, outdoor events that essentially you might need to have public safety personnel available to direct traffic and things of that nature if it's a large event. So there is already a body of experience associated, I believe, in many communities in that regard. But I also think that as we move forward and as we've already experienced, we're going to see a lot more demand probably for the use of certain public spaces than we have in the past, especially under conditions where we have still concern about the impacts of the health impacts of the pandemic and potentially any future variants that may occur down the road. But the other thing that especially when it comes to downtowns, many, if not most communities that have downtowns, have already make a commitment to support that downtown in a certain manner with things like public parking, for example. So in many respects, the businesses are already benefiting from a public investment. And while, the use of additional space today may be considered, additional benefit to a private business, if you think about it, you have a broader objective in terms of trying to keep your downtown viable. And I think you can certainly build that argument that this is an appropriate use of public space because maintaining the viability of our businesses is important. They're taxpayers, they're employers, they're what make our community vibrant, they were what make our community interesting. They may be that which attracts new housing opportunities to downtown. We work with the city of Dexter, and that's a great example of a downtown that's really improved. One of our planners is actually on city council. We were talking about this the other day, and most communities like Dexter really views this kind of thing as really promoting the good for all rather than just benefiting a single business. So I think a broader perspective can be taken in this regard.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you, Dick. Like it's a very broad perspective. I mean, you can draw this line forever. Okay, so now people are using public space for, to sort of business, but we've always done that. Where does an Uber
Right.
driver get off making money on a public road? Like, what's that about? So, I mean, you can pretty much draw that line whenever.
Right.
This is just a different type of, a different type of use and a different type of public space that we're just finally, starting a conversation on. But we've always been doing this as a
Yeah,
community,
exactly.
as a governing entity.
And unless you have any like charter restrictions on park use and things like that nature, I mean, it really is a policy decision on the part of your governing body in terms of, what they want to use that park for. And I guess it probably could be argued that it's a public park. And if a class of kids doing learning artistic dance are out there using it, are you really going to tell them that they can't use a park that's a public park? I don't know. I mean, so anyway, these are all, I think, very, very, very important questions, but one that need to be put into a broader context of what's the bigger benefit.
With a quick follow-up on that, with food trucks, have any of you three experienced any pushback from your bricks and mortar restaurants who are basically saying, hey, we're footing the bill for municipal services and incomes our competitors, and they're not? I'm just curious. I've heard that when food trucks first came around 5, 6, 7 years ago as a thing. That was an argument that I was hearing at the local level. Just curious if that came into the discussion.
No, our businesses are getting food trucks. I mean, the way they're seeing it is great. We can operate in 3 different places at once now. They're using their brick and mortar places, their central location, and then they're taking their food trucks to beyond our township and also within our township to, let's say there's a brewery that doesn't have a restaurant option yet, so they will rent out a food truck to go there. It's no one's looked at it as a competing thing, and they've more looked at it as more opportunities for them to get ahead, which has been really nice to see.
Yeah, I agree. I've heard a little bit of pushback, but not a great deal of pushback. But when you begin to look at the forecasted dollars that are spent on food service, there's lots of dollars to go around. there is the convenience, when you have working families, the convenience of pickup food, and the whole variety of reasons why people either want to have limit the amount of cooking they do, or they have limited time to do it. That's why you're going to see we're continuing to see a rise in the food service industry, despite the biggest thing, obviously, right now that's constraining that is labor. And that's where sit-down restaurants are really at a disadvantage to things like food trucks, which can be run by a couple of people. But finding labor is probably the biggest issue right now that I see in not just Ann Arbor, for example, but in many communities where they're not opening until 4 o'clock because they don't have, or not even opening for certain days of the week because they don't have enough labor right now. I suspect that will change, but there's a lot of business to go around in that particular regard.
Tim, did you have any thoughts on that?
I would just echo what they both said. We haven't seen any pushback in our community on the food trucks at all. So in fact, they've probably been embraced more in the past year than ever before. So.
Okay, Mike, I'm not seeing anything in the chat. Anyone in the audience want to kick anything into the chat for the group on any one of the topics: public input, participation, relaxed standards and procedures, or borrowed public space for private profit? Nope. All right, well, last call for chat. All right, seeing none, I would like to thank our panelists. Did a great job. It was a very good conversation. I'd like to thank everybody for attending, and we will be following up with you, and we would welcome your thoughts on this format, virtual as well as topics going forward. and we would really greatly appreciate your feedback. So again, thank you all for participating.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you, Jim.